Chapter 1, Coffee Stronger Than Certainty. Brian Alister liked routines in the same way some people liked beige paint. Quietly, appreciatively, and without emotional fanfare. Wednesday lunch at the diner was one of them. The place sat on the corner 2 blocks from his office, wedged between a nail salon that smelled aggressively of acetone and a dry cleaner that never seemed open when he actually needed it. The diner itself hadn't changed in the 3 years Brian had been working nearby. Same cracked red vinyl booths, same laminated menus that listed today's special even when today was technically yesterday. Same coffee that could probably dissolve a spoon if left unattended. Brian slid into his usual booth, second from the window, left side, set his phone down, and pressed play on his podcast. He didn't need to hear it, really. Just enough noise to keep his thoughts from wandering toward work emails or the vague existential discomfort that occasionally showed up unannounced. He lifted his mug, took a sip, and felt the blessed chemical jolt of caffeine shock him back into focus. Lunch was halfway gone when someone cleared her throat. "Excuse me," a woman said, smiling politely. "Do you mind if I sit here?" Brian looked up. She was his age, maybe a year younger. Dark hair pulled into a low ponytail, casual jacket, neutral smile. Pleasant. Confident. Too confident. He blinked and glanced around the diner. There were 3 empty booths, one directly behind her, another 2 near the counter. The place was busy, sure, but not share a booth with a stranger busy. He looked back at her. "Yes," he said calmly. "I do mind." Her smile faltered, just a little. "Oh, everything else looked full." "It isn't," Brian said. Not unkindly, just factual. She hesitated, clearly recalculating. "Right, okay, sorry." "No problem," Brian replied, already lifting his mug again. She walked off and Brian stared into his coffee. That had never happened to him before. Not once in his 27 years had a woman approached him out of the blue asking to sit with him. Brian knew who he was. He wasn't unattractive, but he wasn't remarkable either. He blended well, quietly competent, approachable only if approached. Astronomical fluke or a setup. Those were the only 2 explanations that made sense. He glanced around the diner again, slower this time, scanning faces instead of furniture. And that was when he saw them. Helen's friends. Both of them. They were wedged into a corner booth, hunched slightly forward, pretending very hard to be interested in their menus while also failing spectacularly at not watching him. One of them caught his eye and looked away too fast. Brian exhaled through his nose. Of course. He slipped his phone into his jacket pocket and stood, moving with the kind of deliberate calm that came from certainty. He crossed the diner, stopping at their booth. "Hi," he said. Both women jumped. "Oh," one of them said. "Brian." "Hey, what a surprise." "Is it?" Brian asked. "Because it looks like you've been here a while." They exchanged a look. "What are you doing here?" the other asked too quickly. Brian tilted his head. "That's my line." Silence stretched. "We were just grabbing lunch," the first one said. "Total coincidence." Brian nodded once. "Then you won't mind explaining why a stranger just tried to sit in my booth." Both women froze. "She what?" Brian didn't raise his voice, didn't accuse. He simply watched them the way you watch someone trying to lie badly. Curious, detached. "Because statistically," he continued, "those 2 things happening independently on the same day is unlikely. Happening at the same time? Virtually impossible." "That's not." One of them started. Brian lifted a hand. "You don't owe me an explanation. But I won't pretend I don't see what's happening." Neither spoke. He nodded again, stepped back, and returned to his booth long enough to grab his jacket. He didn't finish lunch. That evening, Brian unlocked Helen's apartment like he always did, keys landing in the ceramic bowl by the door with a familiar clink. He kicked off his shoes, shrugged out of his jacket. Helen was on the couch, legs tucked under her, a book resting closed in her lap. "Hey," she said, smiling. "How was your day?" Brian leaned against the doorframe and looked at her for a moment. "It was good," he said. "Until lunch." Her smile turned curious. "What happened at lunch?" He crossed the room and sat opposite her, posture relaxed but attentive. "Did you know?" he asked. Her brow furrowed. "Know what?" There it was. Genuine confusion didn't perform. It didn't flicker or delay. It simply appeared. He nodded slowly. "Okay." He told her everything, the diner, the woman, her friends in the corner booth. He kept his tone even, analytical rather than emotional. "The odds matter to me," he finished. "Not because I'm paranoid, but because patterns tell the truth." Helen was silent for a moment, then sighed sharply. "They didn't tell me," she said. "And they shouldn't have done that." Brian studied her face. No defensiveness, no anticipation, just irritation layered over embarrassment. "I don't believe in tests," she continued, "especially not loyalty tests." "Neither do I," Brian said. She leaned forward. "I trust you, and anyone who thinks I shouldn't doesn't get to interfere with my relationship." Brian felt something ease in his chest. "That's all I needed to hear," he said. She reached for his hand, squeezing it once. "I'll handle it." He nodded. "I know." The coffee had been strong that day. A clarity Brian thought was stronger. Chapter 2, Improbabilities and Boundaries. Brian slept well that night. This surprised him. He'd fully expected his mind to keep replaying the diner in useless high definition. The woman's hesitant smile, the way Helen's friends had looked like kids caught sneaking candy before dinner, the uncomfortable question of why. Brian had already accepted that some things couldn't be controlled, but he still liked to understand them. Yet he woke Thursday morning with a clear head and the quiet sense of intellectual satisfaction that followed a problem that had, at least provisionally, been solved. Helen hadn't known. That mattered. He lay in bed for a moment longer, listening to the muted city sounds through the half-open window. Somewhere below, a delivery truck idled. A car horn punctuated the air with irritation that felt performative rather than necessary. Brian checked his phone. No missed messages. No dramatic apologies. No follow-ups from lunch. Good. He showered, dressed, and left his apartment with the mild, unearned optimism of someone who hadn't yet been challenged by the day. That optimism lasted until 9:17 a.m. Brian worked in an office that prided itself on being just busy enough. The kind of place where no one expected heroics, but everyone would quietly resent you if you failed to color code your spreadsheet tabs correctly. He had chosen the job precisely because it occupied his hours without draining his identity, paid him consistently and, importantly, did not follow him home. Today, however, it followed him to his desk. "Hey," Mark from accounting said, appearing at the edge of Brian's cubicle with the casual menace of someone who had a question and no intention of apologizing for it. "You look serious." Brian took his coffee mug and nudged it a few inches to the left, buying himself time. "I always look serious before coffee number 2. Mark nodded, as if this confirmed a theory. "Relationship stuff?" Brian glanced at him. "Why would you assume that?" "Statistical probability," Mark said. "Men don't look that thoughtful unless they're either emotionally conflicted or planning a resignation email they won't send." Brian considered that. "It's neither. It's been resolved." Mark looked disappointed. "Well, that ruins my morning." Brian smiled faintly and turned back to his screen, the conversation already complete in his mind. Resolved didn't mean forgotten, though. By lunchtime, he had replayed Helen's reaction at least twice more, not with suspicion but with analysis. He respected her response. She had listened. She hadn't rushed to reassure him or minimize the situation. She'd taken ownership of the problem without assuming guilt. That kind of response wasn't romantic in the cinematic sense, but Brian found it deeply attractive. He was halfway through eating leftovers at his desk when his phone buzzed. "Helen, can we grab dinner tonight? My place?" He didn't hesitate. "Brian, yes." 3 letters. Clear. Unambiguous. Intentional. Helen's apartment always smelled faintly like citrus cleaner and coffee, even when neither had been used recently. Brian noticed it the moment he stepped inside, like a familiar punctuation mark at the end of his workday. She was already there, barefoot in soft socks, hair pulled up messily, sleeves rolled. "Hi," she said. "Hi." She leaned in for a brief kiss, not dramatic, not distant, normal, chosen. "How was work?" she asked. "Unremarkable," Brian said. "You?" Helen grimaced. "I love my job. I just wish my coworkers understood that meetings aren't personality hobbies." Brian nodded solemnly. A common affliction. They ordered takeout and sat across from each other at the small kitchen table. There were no theatrics, no dramatic sighs or preambles. Brian appreciated that Helen respected the conversation enough not to pad it. "I spoke to them," she said. Brian paused mid-bite, then set his fork down. "Okay. They confirmed it wasn't your imagination," Helen continued, "which, frankly, offended me on multiple levels." She took a breath, steady but controlled. "They thought they were helping. Their logic, if you can call it that, was that they just wanted reassurance." Brian's mouth twitched. "Reassurance for whom?" Helen snorted softly. "Excellent question." She met his eyes. "I told them we don't test each other. Ever. If I stop trusting you, the relationship is already over. There's no experiment that fixes that." Brian felt something settle into place. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For not making it about fear," he said. "A lot of people confuse fear with care." Helen leaned back slightly, considering him. "You're very calm about all this." "I'm calm because nothing actually happened," Brian replied. "And because you handled it directly." She smiled, small and sincere. "They're not thrilled with me right now." "I imagine not," Brian said. "But I was clear." She shrugged. "If someone interferes in my relationship without my consent, that's a boundary issue, not a loyalty issue." Brian nodded slowly. "That aligns with my thinking." Helen laughed quietly. "Of course it does." They ate in companionable silence for a moment. Then Helen spoke again, her tone gentler. "Did it shake you? At all?" Brian considered before answering. He owed her honesty, not dramatized honesty, but the useful kind. "It reminded me," he said carefully, "that other people will always project their fears onto functional relationships, especially when the relationship doesn't match their expectations." Helen tilted her head. "And you?" "I'm not afraid of the relationship," Brian said. I'd be afraid of staying in one where respect had to be tested instead of practiced. She smiled then, not bright, not teasing. Grounded. That's why I chose you, she said. Statistical anomaly? Brian offered. Conscious decision, Helen corrected. They both laughed, the tension dissolving not because it had been forced away, but because it no longer had fuel. Later, as Brian gathered his jacket to leave, Helen walked him to the door. This didn't damage us, she said, almost to herself. No, Brian agreed. It clarified us. She kissed him again, firm this time. Good, she said. Brian stepped into the hallway feeling something he rarely named but often valued. Stability wasn't boring. It was deliberate. Chapter 3, The Friend's Problem. Brian didn't go looking for the problem. The problem came to him with espresso foam and forced cheer. Saturday morning found Brian seated at a small cafe near Helen's apartment. One he'd been to exactly twice before, and never by personal request. It specialized in things he didn't need explained, single-origin beans, minimalist pastries, and chairs that were aggressively uncomfortable in a way that suggested endurance was part of the experience. He was already on his second coffee when Helen excused herself to the restroom. Don't let them scare you, she'd said lightly, standing. Brian had raised an eyebrow. That reassurance would be more effective if you hadn't framed it as a warning. She'd laughed and walked away before elaborating, which was when Helen's two best friends appeared. They approached with synchronized smiles, drinks in hand, moving with the confidence of people who had rehearsed this moment, or at least talked about it extensively. Brian, one of them said, mind if we join you? Brian took in the empty chairs surrounding him. Then he nodded once. You're already here. They sat. Up close, Brian could see the tension they were trying to mask with politeness. It came out in the small pauses, the way they aligned their cups, the exaggerated casualness. So, the second one said, drawing out the word. Helen says things are good. They are, Brian replied. A beat passed. That whole diner thing, the first said. It was misunderstood. Brian folded his hands on the table. No, it wasn't. They exchanged glances. We were just curious, the second one said. You can't blame us for wanting the best for her. Brian nodded. I can blame you for interfering without consent. That landed harder than they'd expected. The first one frowned. That seems harsh. That seems accurate, Brian corrected. Concern doesn't entitle you to experiments. Silence settled, thick and awkward. Helen returned moments later, stopping short when she saw the body language. Oh, she said. You've already started. One friend opened her mouth. Helen held up a hand. I'll handle this. She turned to Brian. Are you okay? Yes, Brian said sincerely. We were just establishing definitions. Helen snorted softly. That checks out. She pulled out a chair and sat between them, posture relaxed but unmistakably firm. I told you both, she said, looking at her friends, that you crossed a line. We apologized, one said. You justified, Helen corrected. Those aren't the same. Brian watched Helen now, not with surprise but with appreciation. This was the version of her he'd learned to trust. Calm, clear, unwilling to soften boundaries simply to keep peace. We were scared, the other said quietly. Helen's expression softened, but her tone didn't. Fear is a feeling. It's not a permission slip. Brian added nothing. He didn't need to. Eventually, the conversation shifted, weather, work, neutral territory. But the air never fully reset. When the friends finally left, hugs were polite rather than warm. Helen exhaled after they were gone. Well, that was exhausting. Brian leaned back. You handled it well. She tilted her head. You're not mad. No, Brian said. But I am observant. She smiled faintly. That might be worse. He smiled back. They walked out together into the mild afternoon, hands brushing, but not yet taking hold. Some moments felt better when chosen deliberately. As they reached her building, Helen stopped. There's something I should ask you, she said. Brian waited. Did it bother you? That they doubted you? He considered. Not really. People doubt what they don't control. Her fingers laced with his then. And me. That would have bothered me, he said honestly. If you had. She squeezed his hand. I didn't. Brian knew. They climbed the stairs together, not racing past the moment, not dragging it out. Just moving forward, step by step. Chapter 4, The Echo of Doubt. Brian didn't consider himself a ruminator. He observed. He catalogued. He assessed. Then, if necessary, he acted. Rumination implied circular thinking, emotional mud you trudged through without gaining ground. Brian preferred straight lines and conclusions, which was why the dull echo in the back of his mind that Monday morning annoyed him more than it troubled him. It wasn't fear. It was recognition. He sat at his desk, staring at a spreadsheet he'd already reviewed twice, feeling the strange sensation of having resolved a conflict while still living in its afterimage. Everything with Helen was good, better than good, actually. Clear. Grounded. Honest. So why was his brain circling the question of why this bothered him at all? Penny for your thoughts, Mark said, appearing again like a summoned specter. Brian glanced up. Inflation adjusted. Mark smiled. You've been staring at the same cell for 3 minutes. That's not productivity. That's philosophy. Brian leaned back in his chair. Have you ever noticed how people distrust stability? Mark considered. In general, or just women who lure you into diner booths? Brian sighed. Never mind. Mark grinned. No. Now I'm invested. What happened? Brian kept the response vague. External interference. Well-intentioned. Misguided. Ah, Mark said knowingly. The classic. Classic what? People assuming calm means complacency. Mark shrugged. Some folks need chaos to feel engaged. Brian sat with that after Mark wandered off, absently comparing it to his own history. He hadn't grown up in chaos. His upbringing was steady to the point of predictability. No shouting, no dramatic exits, no emotional roulette. Love had been quiet and dependable. It had shown up consistently instead of insisting on applause. Maybe that was the problem. Not with Helen, but with how the world tended to frame relationships. That thought followed him through the day, through the hum of fluorescent lights and the gentle dissatisfaction of his job, all the way to Wednesday night when Helen came over to his apartment. She curled up on his couch, legs tucked under her, scrolling through her phone while he finished loading the dishwasher. Your place feels more minimal, she said. Brian glanced around. That's a polite way of saying empty. No, she smiled. Intentional. He dried his hands and joined her. That word is doing a lot of work lately. She tilted her head, studying him. You're quieter than normal. I'm thinking, Brian said. Dangerous, Helen replied lightly. Should I be concerned? He met her gaze. About us? No. About you? She asked. Brian considered before answering. Maybe. She set her phone aside. That alone told him she was listening. I keep thinking about the idea of tests, he said. Not the diner specifically, but the impulse behind it. Helen nodded slowly. People test what they don't trust, and they don't trust what they don't understand, Brian added. A calm relationship makes some people uncomfortable. Helen smiled faintly. You're saying we're boring. I'm saying we're threatening, Brian corrected. We don't provide cautionary tales. She laughed at that. You sound very proud. I'm explanatory, Brian said, then paused. But it did make me wonder if I'm too reserved. Helen's eyebrows lifted slightly. That's new. He shrugged. I like consistency. I don't mistake intensity for depth. And you think someone else might? She asked carefully. People do, Brian said. Often. Helen leaned back, considering him with that thoughtful expression that told him she was choosing her words with care. I don't need fireworks, she said. I need trust. Fireworks are loud. They fade. Brian felt something shift. Not relief, he already had that. Something quieter. Confirmation. Good, he said. Because I'm much better at being present than performing. She smiled and rested her head against his shoulder. They stayed like that for a while, not speaking, not filling the silence with reassurance or plans, just existing together, neither of them testing the weight of the moment. Later, as Helen gathered her bag to leave, she paused by the door. Next weekend, she said. There's a work thing, casual, plus one's welcome. Brian raised an eyebrow. You're inviting me into a social experiment? She laughed. No tests, I promise. He smiled. Then yes. After she left, Brian stood alone in his living room, listening to the quiet he hadn't realized he cherished until it had almost been disrupted by other people's fears. Stability, he decided, wasn't the absence of tension. It was the strength to talk when tension appeared, and that, unlike fireworks, could last. Chapter 5, Independent Variables. The idea was Helen's. Brian had respected that immediately. They were standing in her kitchen on a Tuesday night, the air filled with the comfortable chaos of overlapping schedules. She was packing leftovers into containers while he rinsed plates, both of them moving around each other without thinking. I've been wondering something, Helen said. Brian glanced over. You always preface important things with that sentence. She smiled. You noticed. He nodded. Proceed. Helen leaned back against the counter. What do you think would happen if we didn't see each other for a week? Brian paused mid-rinse, droplets tapping against ceramic. That depends, he said slowly. Is this hypothetical? Or are you proposing an experiment? She laughed. Not a test. A choice. He turned off the faucet and faced her fully. Okay, he said. Under what conditions? Her smile widened slightly. You do love structure. I respect clarity, Brian replied. They're cousins. Helen crossed her arms, not defensively, but thoughtfully. I think we're good together. I also think it might be valuable to see what good looks like when we're not defaulting to proximity. Brian considered that. He didn't feel threatened by the idea. That alone told him a lot. You're asking for a pause, not a withdrawal, he said. Yes, Helen agreed quickly. We talk. We check in. We just don't automatically assume shared time. Brian nodded once. A control case. She laughed. Please don't put that phrase on a relationship. He smiled faintly. Fine. A week. They sealed it not with drama, but with understanding. No ground rules were negotiated beyond the obvious. No emotional safety nets padded the edges. They trusted the structure they'd already built. The first night felt odd. Brian came home to his apartment and stood in the entryway longer than usual, keys still in hand. The place hadn't changed, but his awareness of it had. Normally, nights like this would end with him checking the time automatically. Should I head over? Will she come here? Instead, there was nothing to check. He made a simple dinner and ate it slowly, the quiet not oppressive but noticeable. He put on music not to fill space, but to mark it. Later, he caught himself reaching for his phone. He stopped. Not avoidance, he said out loud, amused. Presence. He sent Helen a message anyway. Brian home. Cooked something edible. Thinking about probabilities. The response came a few minutes later. Helen, proud of you. I almost folded and drove over. Didn't. Making tea. Brian smiled. The week unfolded in small adjustments. He stayed later at work one night without checking the clock. Went for a run after another. Picked up a book that had been sitting on his shelf for months, untouched not from disinterest but inertia. The surprising thing wasn't loneliness. It was how easily he adapted. On Thursday, he met Mark for a drink, something he rarely did midweek. You seem different, Mark said, sipping his beer. Different how? Less preoccupied. More deliberate. Brian considered that. I'm running a week-long observation. Mark smirked. Ah, relationship science. Autonomy, Brian corrected. Within connection. Mark blinked. You're not helping my stereotype. Brian chuckled and didn't explain further. On Helen's side of town, she felt it too. She took a yoga class she'd been postponing. Stayed late at work without guilt. Slept diagonally across her bed like a starfish. Something she'd stopped doing without realizing when Brian had become a frequent presence. She missed him, but not anxiously. When they talked, it was unhurried. Their conversations weren't placeholders for touch. They stood on their own. By Sunday, both of them noticed the same thing independently. They weren't filling gaps. They were choosing connection. They met again the following Tuesday evening. Not ceremoniously. Not with a countdown. Brian showed up at Helen's apartment at the usual time. She opened the door, and for half a second they just looked at each other. Well, Helen said. Well, Brian echoed. They hugged, longer than usual, still measured. Inside, they sat on the couch, knees angled toward each other. An unspoken question hanging between them. So, Helen said, what did you find? Brian smiled. That space doesn't weaken things. It reveals them. She nodded slowly. I found that I like missing you. I do too, Brian admitted. Without urgency. Helen leaned back, considering him. That might be the least romantic phrasing possible. Yet accurate, Brian said gently. She laughed and reached for his hand. The experiment concluded without fanfare. Not a test passed. A choice confirmed. Chapter 6, Outside Voices, Inside Decisions. The invitation was not dramatic. That, Brian would later realize, was the entire point. It arrived on a Thursday afternoon via a calendar notification he'd almost dismissed without reading. Team social, Friday 6:30 p.m. casual. Optional. Normally, Brian ignored anything labeled optional. Optional events at work were rarely optional in spirit and often exhausting in execution. But this one had a note beneath it, handwritten, not automated. Attendance appreciated. Client relations, informal introductions. Brian sighed softly and accepted. He didn't bring it up to Helen right away. Not because he was hiding it, but because it didn't feel like something that needed permission or reassurance. That in itself felt new. Friday evening arrived with the measured pace of a week ending properly. Brian went home first, changed into something that struck the careful balance between approachable and neutral, then checked his phone. A message from Helen waited. Helen, how's your night looking? Brian, I have a work thing. Nothing exciting. You? Helen. Wine with coworkers. One of them adopted a dog and won't stop showing photos. Brian smiled. Brian, stay strong. No declarations. No scheduling experiments. Just shared awareness. The bar was louder than Brian expected. Nothing unbearable. Just energetic in the way groups became when alcohol loosened professional restraint but hadn't yet dismantled it. Brian found Mark near the bar. You came, Mark said, impressed. I was curious, Brian replied. That should alarm you. Mark laughed and handed him a drink. You look relaxed. I am, Brian said, then paused. That's also alarming. They found a high table near the back. More coworkers drifted in, introductions layered over names Brian barely needed. He listened more than he spoke, comfortable in observation. That was when he noticed her. She wasn't striking in the theatrical sense. No sharp angles demanding attention. But she was self-possessed in a way Brian admired instinctively. Calm posture. Direct eye contact without performance. When she laughed, it was brief, genuine, unguarded. She joined their table halfway through a conversation about office inefficiencies. I'm Jenna, she said, extending a hand. Brian, he replied, shaking it lightly. She smiled. You're the spreadsheet whisperer. He blinked. I beg your pardon? Mark grinned. Legend travels fast. Brian shook his head. Exaggerated. Still impressive, Jenna said. I'm terrible with numbers. I like people. Numbers don't respond. Brian huffed a quiet laugh. They do, actually. Just not emotionally. She laughed at that. A quick, appreciative sound. They talked easily. Nothing charged. Nothing engineered. Just conversation that flowed without friction. At some point, Mark wandered off. Someone else took his place. Then they drifted too. Brian found himself alone at the table with Jenna, both of them sipping drinks and discussing the merits of routine. You seem very grounded, she said. Brian considered the word. I prioritize stability. It's efficient. That's a very Brian answer. He smiled despite himself. Is that good or bad? Refreshing, she said. Most people mistake chaos for passion. Brian felt the echo of that phrase ripple through him. He didn't respond immediately. Helen appeared in his mind, not as contrast, not as competition, but as context. The way she listened without performing interest. The way she chose him deliberately, without urgency or spectacle. Jenna tipped her glass slightly. You thinking heavy thoughts? Comparative ones, Brian replied honestly. She studied him a moment. You're taken. Brian nodded. Yes. She smiled, not disappointed, not offended. Just acknowledging reality. That explains the lack of probing, she said lightly. Brian chuckled. I'm clarified. They sat in companionable silence for a minute before Jenna stood. Well, she said. Nice to meet you, clarified. Likewise, Brian said. Thank you for the conversation. She nodded and walked away without weight or drama. Brian stayed a few minutes longer, finished his drink, then excused himself. He didn't leave triumphant. He left thoughtful. On the train ride home, Brian replayed the evening. Not with guilt, but with interest. Nothing had happened. Nothing had even almost happened. That was what mattered. The clarity had come not from resistance, but from preference. He chose Helen every day not because he lacked options, but because the option of her was aligned with who he was. He realized then that loyalty wasn't tested when temptation was obvious. It was affirmed when temptation felt unnecessary. When he got home, there was a message waiting. Helen. Wine night devolved into dog genetics debate. Are you surviving? Brian smiled and typed. Brian. I had an unexpectedly enlightening evening. No chaos detected. Pause. Then her reply. Helen. I love that sentence for reasons I don't fully understand. Brian. I'll explain tomorrow. He set the phone down, feeling lighter than he had in days. Not because he'd proven anything, but because he hadn't needed to. Chapter 7, Renegotiation. Brian did not tell the story right away. Not because he was hiding it, but because he respected timing. He believed conversations landed better when they weren't dropped like confessions or disguised as reassurance. Some things deserved a calm surface, space, the assumption of goodwill. So he waited until Sunday evening, when Helen came over with a bag of groceries and no agenda beyond cooking something vaguely ambitious. They moved easily around his kitchen, she chopping vegetables, he managing the stove. Music played softly, something instrumental that filled space without demanding attention. Helen glanced at him. You've been smiling at nothing for 10 minutes. Brian stirred the pan. That feels generous. I was probably smiling at context. She arched an eyebrow. Do I want to know? Yes, Brian said. But not urgently. She laughed. You're impossible. That's not new information. They sat to eat, plates warm, conversation drifting from work to the dog photos she'd survived on Friday. Only when both of them had slowed, when the enjoyment of the meal replaced hunger, did Brian set his fork down. I had someone express interest in me, he said. Helen didn't flinch. She took a sip of water, then nodded. Okay. That response told Brian everything. Not defensive, not searching, just present. At the work thing, he continued, it wasn't a situation, just potential. Brief. Helen leaned back slightly. And I realized something, Brian said. About seriousness. Her expression shifted, not alarmed, just attentive. Go on. Brian chose his words. When we first started dating, we defined seriousness as intention, clarity, respect, all of which still apply. He paused. But I think seriousness evolves. Helen's lips curved faintly. I was hoping you'd say that. He smiled. I realized seriousness isn't about absence of alternatives. It's about preference. She nodded slowly. I didn't feel tempted, Brian continued. Not because I was resisting something, but because what we have already answers the question. Helen studied him for a long moment, then exhaled softly. That's reassuring in a very Brian way. I take that as a compliment. It is. She smiled, then tilted her head. I had a realization too. Brian raised an eyebrow. Should I brace myself? No, she said. You're going to like it. She folded her hands in her lap. I realized I don't need certainty to feel secure anymore. I need participation. Brian felt the weight of that quiet, meaningful. Meaning, he prompted. She met his eyes. Meaning I don't need promises framed as guarantees. I need choices made proactively. Brian nodded, the gears already aligning. So, he said, we renegotiate. Helen smiled. Exactly. They sat in that for a moment, not afraid of silence. Brian spoke first. I don't need to escalate our relationship through milestones to feel committed. Helen nodded. I don't need performative intimacy to feel connected. He smiled. Then what does the next phase look like? She laughed. You sound like you're scheduling a strategic planning meeting. Structure calms me. She considered. It looks like continuing to choose each other, but with more visibility, more integration. Brian's brow creased slightly, not concern but thoughtfulness. Not merging identities, she clarified immediately. Just opening lanes. Brian sat back. I can support that. You already do, she said. I'm just naming it. Brian appreciated that. They finished dinner and moved to the couch. Legs tucked under them, the conversation not over, but settled. Helen rested her head against his shoulder. I like that we can talk about this without pressure. Pressure distorts data, Brian replied. She laughed quietly. You really do think in models. Only when stakes are high. She tilted her head to look at him. Do the stakes feel high? Brian didn't hesitate. They feel chosen. That made her smile. Later, as Helen prepared to leave, she paused by the door. One more thing, she said. Brian waited. I don't want us to get comfortable in a way that stops growth. Brian nodded. Agreed. Comfort should support movement, not replace it. She reached for his hand. So we keep checking in. Yes, Brian said. Not because we're unsure. Because we care. She squeezed his fingers once, deliberately. Good, she said. I like us. Brian nodded. Me too. After she left, Brian stood for a moment in the quiet of his apartment. Not alone, but not crowded with expectation either. The renegotiation hadn't felt like a turning point, felt like calibration. And Brian knew, quietly clearly, that this was how things lasted. Chapter 9, Respect, Practice Daily. The thing Brian noticed first was how ordinary the morning felt. That, more than anything else, told him he was standing on solid ground. It was a Wednesday, unremarkable, dependable, the kind that didn't announce itself. Sunlight filtered through the blinds in narrow bands, catching the edge of the kitchen counter. The coffee maker clicked, hissed, and hummed with practiced familiarity. Helen leaned against the counter, hair still damp from the shower, scrolling absently through her phone. Brian poured 2 mugs. No rocket fuel today? She asked, glancing up. I'm pacing myself, Brian replied. Sustainability. She smiled. Look at you, thinking long-term. He handed her the mug. Sometimes. They stood there in companionable silence, sipping, not filling the quiet, letting it exist. So, Helen said eventually, I got the position. Brian didn't react explosively. He smiled. It started small and built naturally, the way real joy did when it wasn't competing for attention. That's excellent, he said. How do you feel? She exhaled, relief and excitement overlapping. Capable, slightly terrified, mostly proud. He nodded. That combination suggests growth. She laughed softly. You're very good at not making this about how it changes us. Brian shrugged. Nothing changes us unless we let it. She considered that. You're assuming we keep choosing each other. I am, Brian said without hesitation. Are you? Helen met his eyes, steady and warm. Yes. They finished coffee and gathered their things, moving through the morning routine with the kind of coordination that came not from habit alone, but from attention. Brian walked Helen to the door. I'll see you tonight, she asked. Yes, he said. Dinner. Nothing ambitious. Perfect. He kissed her. Not the dramatic kind, not the performative one. Just enough. Just right. After she left, Brian lingered a moment in the quiet apartment. He thought about the diner, the interruption, the tests that never happened and the ones that mattered. He thought about work nights and separate apartments and space that had revealed strength instead of absence. He understood something now. Loyalty wasn't vigilance. Respect wasn't deference. Love wasn't proven under surveillance. It was practiced daily, in calm mornings and honest conversations, in choosing not to dramatize what could simply be understood. Later that afternoon, Brian returned to the diner. Same booth, same coffee. The waitress raised an eyebrow as she set down his mug. Back again. Routine, Brian said. She smiled. Comforting. Brian took a sip and looked around, not for problems, not for patterns, just present. The coffee was still strong enough to launch small aircraft. And for once, that was all he needed.